What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. Welcome back to another installment of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go back through the previous weekend's competitive events, look for lists that have all wins on their record, and break them down. And this is an absolute slobber knocker of a weekend. We had tons of large events go down, including several major level events with 100 or more players. And we have tons to talk about, so let's dive right in. Starting off, as always, with a metagame breakdown, let's talk about which events had the most undefeated results this weekend. Necrons continued to do fairly well with 2 undefeated results from the Bastion Games Warlords: Unforgiven, a hell of an event name for that one, as well as the BFS Grand Tournament. Grey Knights took down Battlefield Birmingham 22, as well as the enormous 100-plus player Iberian Open. Those are both actually relatively large events, so Grey Knights had an incredible showing of a weekend this week. Black Templars also continued to do fairly well with wins at both Toys of Mass Destruction as well as Last of the Summer Winehammer. And we saw other Space Marine subfactions also do well. Blood Angels and Space Wolves both had undefeated results. Blood Angels at the massive Rocky Mountain Open put on by Frontline Gaming, and that one was streamed over by our friends at War Games Live if you want to see some live coverage of those games. Space Wolves also going undefeated at Battlefield Birmingham as well. Moving back to the Bastion Games Warlords: Unforgiven, Thousand Suns also coming out of the woodwork with a little bit of a result, as well as Tau Empire from the Ides of March GT that I actually streamed on this channel. So if you caught me over the weekend with my live coverage of that event, I really appreciate you. And you can watch the Tau list, which we'll talk about later on, in several games over the course of the weekend. Big thanks to the Ides of March GT for asking me out. I'll post links to the games in the comment section and the video description. For those who don't know, I do cover large events fairly frequently, and in fact, it is becoming a much more frequent occurrence as the weeks go on. Usually 1 to 2 weeks a month, I will be out and streaming events, but that looks to be happening more and more often, so please drop a subscribe on the channel. Remember to turn notifications on if you want to see it when I go live. I also have a stream calendar, which you can find on my website, that showcases when I'm live, both over on Twitch with online play, as well as in person on this channel. Moving back to undefeated lists, Astra Militarum took the Talvisota Winter Assault. Chaos Knights coming in hot with an undefeated result at the Energy City Open. Adepta Sororitas at the Lords of War GT. World Eaters, another undefeated result from the Rocky Mountain Open. They had several undefeated players because that was a very large event. And last but certainly not least, the Free State GT was taken down by none other than Leagues of Votann. An incredibly diverse selection of event wins this week. Lots of Space Marines, I think, as we are used to seeing at this point. Space Marines tend to be a high population count within the player base, so we do expect to see more Space Marines undefeated than other factions, theoretically. But on the flip side, they are getting a ton of undefeated results with several different factions. And we actually have seen Ultramarines and their style of army fall off a little bit in exchange for the newly buffed Sons of Sanguinius out of Blood Angels, as well as Space Wolf and Black Templars lists, which is super cool. So there's a lot of diversity both within the Space Marine super faction and within the metagame in general. Outside of Space Marines, only a couple of factions with multiple undefeated results this week points to the fact that a lot of stuff is open to win, and that is a super good sign for the health of the metagame. Now, speaking of stuff that can win, let's dive into the lists in specific and talk about Necrons. We're going to jump directly into the Bastion Games Warlords: Unforgiven with Harry McComb's Canoptech Court. First of all, super cool to see a non-Hypercrypt Legion list doing well out of Necrons. Canoptech Court has always been kind of hanging out in the... Canoptech Court has always been kind of waiting in the wings for Hypercrypt Legion to become a little bit less popular, and the styles of lists like this are becoming more and more popular as we discover just the ridiculous resilience of this type of army. This list is almost entirely protected by 4+ invulnerable saves, backed up by Feel No Pains, which makes it an incredibly sticky prospect to remove. The list is bringing 3 Catan shards, a classic Transcendent Catan to give the list a little bit of maneuverability, as well as Catan shards of both the Nightbringer and Void Dragon. They're followed up by a trio of Technomancers, one with the Dimensional Sanctum to allow his unit to infiltrate, one with the Metallodermo Tesla Weave to give him some mortal wounds to enemies charging into him. That's mostly there as a little bit of a points filler. We have some support units in the form of 2 Locust Destroyers and 2 Locust Heavy Destroyers, as well as 2 units of Canoptek Acanthrites. These guys are cute little infiltrating Canoptek units. They do get all the benefits of being a Canoptek unit thanks to Canoptek Court, but they also infiltrate and have a little melt-a-gun as well. Maybe not the most effective combatants of all time, but being an infiltrator innately and having the Canoptek keyword, so you are available to be targeted by all of the incredible strats that Canoptek Court gives you access to, makes these guys pretty effective. We also then have 3 units of Canoptek Race, these guys equipped with Particle Casters and Vicious Claws in order to attach to those Technomancers and really give the list its backbone. It's interesting that we're seeing the more ranged focus varieties of Canoptek Court, I think, fall by the wayside. A lot of lists in the past have run things like Canoptek Doomstalkers to make use of their rerolls at range. We also saw units like Immortals making use of the rerolls when you have an attached Cryptek in the unit, but I think what people are finding is that the resilience of the detachment, especially alongside the Lone Operative strat that they have access to, can really compound with profiles like the Transcendent Catans, the characters especially, with their 4+ invulnerable save and 5+ feel no pain, alongside damage halving, and backing that up with 18 Canoptek Race with basically the same save profile. They don't have half damage, but they are 4 wounds a model, which makes them hard to kill wholesale, and they have those same save profiles as well, making this list ridiculously tanky, have relatively high OC in the middle of the table, fairly fast and okay at fighting in melee, and it might not kill the entire world, but the entire world has a tough time killing it, so it's able to basically just chill on objectives until Judgment Day and trumpets sound, and your opponents lose by not scoring any primary. Speaking of scoring primary, however, we can move over to the Iberian Open, where Monway won with Grey Knights, a faction that is very good at scoring points. This list is a relatively interesting combination of older style Grey Knights armies that were focused more on onboard infantry presence, and the newer styles, which is focused more on vehicles. It brings 3 Brotherhood Librarians, these guys good for dealing insane numbers of mortal wounds while potentially performing actions because their Vortex of Doom is not actually a range attack, which is kind of sweet. We also see a Brotherhood Tech Marine in order to buff the vehicles in the army. One of those vehicles being a Grandmaster in Nemesis Dreadknight, making use of the newly improved Nemesis Dreadknight weapon profiles. That guy's got the Sigil of Exigence, so he is able to redeploy in response to being targeted. So he's able to poke his way out, fire his heavy Psy Cannon. He is equipped with an Incinerator in this build as well, and then potentially redeploy back into safety in response if your opponent tries to kill him. We also see then a Brotherhood Terminator squad to attach one of those Brotherhood Librarians into in order to give them some ablative wounds, and a nice Northestium Terminator to bring back casualties that the Brotherhood Librarian accidentally inflicts on the squad with his own psychic powers. We then had a 5 model Strike squad to lock objectives in and act as a utility unit, a 5 model Paladin squad. Those guys can jump into a Land Raider Redeemer, giving them a little bit of expanded melee threat and the Redeemer's incredible mid-board profile. It doesn't get the effects of the Teleport Strike Force, so it's not able to pick up and drop like the other units in the army because it doesn't have its built-in teleporter, but it is able to just start in the middle of the table and actually give Grey Knights a little bit more presence than they normally have. Grey Knights can be pushed off objectives fairly well because a lot of their game plan relies on using stratagems like Mists of Deimos and relics like the Sigil of Exigence to run away from their opponent, but the Land Raider Redeemer certainly doesn't do that, and it mostly sits in the middle and overwatches everything to death, which is fairly good. It also draws a lot of fire from the Nemesis Dreadknights, of which there are 3 additional in the list, so we are rocking a total of 4 Dreadknights if you include the Nemesis Grandmaster as well, alongside that Land Raider Redeemer. All of those potentially targets to be buffed by that Brotherhood Tech Marine and repaired, alongside the 3 Librarians that can sit in the back and do actions and blow people up with their mind bullets. Overall, fairly effective list, obviously. Adds a lot of firepower to a normally relatively scoring heavy Grey Knights variety, and I think as we can see, Dread Knights definitely proving their worth with the January data slate updates. That moves us on to Space Marines proper, not the Sanctic Astartes of the Grey Knights, but the regular Adeptus Astartes that make up the Space Marine chapters. And the first chapter we're going to talk about is the most effective for the weekend Black Templars, a faction that Aiden Brocklehurst took to an undefeated record at the Toys of Mass Destruction GT. Aiden was running an Ironstorm Spearhead, using the ever-effective Crusader squads to the best of their ability. Ironstorm Spearhead obviously giving every single unit in the army a floating reroll, which is good on small units with individual heavy weapons. We had one Phobos Librarian with Master of the Machine War, as well as a Tech Marine with Target Augury Web to give an aura of lethal hits to vehicles. We then had 4 Crusader squads, each of them including maximum Melta shootiness, a multi-Melta, Melta-Gun, and Inferno Pistol inside each of those squads for 75 points. What a bargain! We then had 2 Eliminator squads, as well as an Infiltrator squad to attach that Phobos Librarian onto. Following that up was a Scout squad and some Inquisitorial henchmen to add a little bit of support to the army and a ton of vehicles. That included a fairly well-rounded brick of gladiators, 2 Black Templars Gladiator Lancers, paying the extra 5 points for that datasheet in order to get a pintle-mounted multi-Melta instead of the normally equipped heavy stubber, 3 Gladiator Reapers, Black Templars Gladiator Reapers, I should say, alongside a Predator Destructor. So we have 3 dedicated anti-tank vehicles and 3 dedicated anti-infantry vehicles, giving the army a lot of flexibility depending on the profiles that you're firing at. And not to mention the fact that those Gladiator Reapers, as well as the Lancers with their Fragstorm grenade launchers, can fire a ton of shots if they super need to, all of them potentially getting lethal hits with the Target Augury Web, and actually putting work into higher toughness enemies, be them infantry or vehicles. We then saw an Impulsor as well as 2 Rhinos. The 2 Rhinos could embark the 2 Crusader squads. That allows each of them to firing deck 2 models out the top, probably those 2 multi-Meltas, making them actually into fairly effective anti-tank shooting platforms, at least at close range, because they're going to be able to fire those 4 multi-Melta shots out the top. Each of them is going to get a single reroll, each Rhino, I should say, not the Crusader squads themselves. They are just applying their weapon to the vehicle when they're firing out of the firing deck. They don't each individually shoot, so you don't get multiple instances of the floating reroll, just the one for the vehicle and its embarked units. But we then have an Impulsor as well. That guy can embark the 2 Eliminator squads, and depending on the FAQ that you're using, because this has never been FAQ'd by Games Workshop proper, you can potentially fire the Eliminator squads, move them using the special ability from the Eliminator Sergeant with the Instigator Bolt Carbine up to the Impulsor, embark into the Impulsor, and then use its firing deck to shoot them again. Using the Ironstorm Spearhead benefit, you're going to be getting floating rerolls on each Eliminator squad and then the Impulsor as well once they embark, making the combined shooting very effective from those kind of 4-ish activations that you get from them. Not to mention the fact that you're also benefiting potentially from Target Augury Web if the Impulsor ends up near enough to the Tech Marine, making the 2 last fusiles in each Eliminator squad incredibly dangerous. Interestingly, we've been seeing Black Templars moving more towards Righteous Crusaders style armies in the last couple of weeks. We haven't seen a style of Black Templars like this that's really abusing the fact that they get multi-Meltas in all their gladiators, as well as their super efficient Crusader squads. We did see a little bit of a nerf to Crusader squads in January, which I think kind of curtailed their play, but definitely the list archetype is still strong, and the number of shooting activations that you get access to with random multi-Meltas applied everywhere is incredibly good, especially against higher toughness or high wound count enemies. Now that moves us on to the other Space Marine chapters. Starting first with Blood Angels and their Sons of Sanguinius, which Zach Kerstetter took to an undefeated record at one of the weekend's largest events, the Rocky Mountain Open. Again, this was streamed over by Wargames Live, so if you want to go see some coverage of that event, you can go check them out over there. This list was running an absolute ton of Death Company, really making use of not only the Blood Angel special abilities, but also their special units as well. It was led by Lamarties and the Sanguinor, alongside two captains, a chaplain, and a combi lieutenant. Those captains attached into Assault Intercessor squads, as the chaplain attached into a large unit. The chaplain could attach into a large unit of Death Company, and Lamarties had a unit of 10 Jump Pack Death Company to jump into as well. We then had 3 Scout Squads for utility, a Gladiator Lancer, and a Land Raider Redeemer to deliver those big Death Company bricks, alongside a Rhino to potentially attach one of the other Death Company units. I guess we could put the Assault Intercessors into the Land Raider as well. They can't actually go into the Rhino, being Tacticus units. With those captains attached into the Assault Intercessor squads, they become absolute absolute powerhouses. The Assault Intercessors give them wound rerolls against enemies on objectives, and are base OC2 themselves, so they're actually good at taking objectives. And when the captains activate their finest hour, getting a bunch of additional attacks and devastating wounds with their power fists, they actually hit like a ton of bricks. If you go into a medium-sized vehicle that's on an objective, the captain himself will probably just kill it, and you probably get some incidental attacks out of the rest of the unit as well, and especially alongside the additional strength bonuses that you're getting from Sons of Sanguinius nowadays. Those guys can absolutely hit dramatically above their weight class and do insane damage. The same obviously goes for the Death Company Marines with Power Fists equipped. Those guys go up to enormous strength values and can get access to lance and lethal hits from stratagems in the detachment as well. With either jump packs or the Redeemer delivering them into melee, those guys don't have too much trouble, despite the fact that they are missing out of benefits like the Stormlands detachment or Assault Doctrine from other Space Marine detachments that gives them advance and charge. Now, speaking of advance and charge, we can move over to the battlefield Birmingham, where Leonard Percival ended with an undefeated result using a Stormlance task force coming out of the Space Wolves chapter. Now, this is a little bit of a missed opportunity. Leonard could have played Black Templars and given us back-to-back characters from Arthurian Legends playing the Knight-themed Black Templars faction, a transgression for which I will probably never forgive him. That said, he was playing a Phobos Librarian, Logan Grimnar on foot, just in his Terminator armor, 3 Wolfguard battle leaders on Thunderwolves, as well as 2 Wolf Lords on Thunderwolves, those guys attaching into some of the 3 units of Thunderwolf cavalry. So we don't have the full 24 Thunderwolves, I guess, in this build, because we are missing out 1 Wolf Lord on one of the units, but we're basically close enough. Only 23 Thunderwolves in this one is just fine. That said, we are backing up with some shooting. We do have 2 Gladiator Lancers, as well as some utility from an Infiltrator squad to attach the Phobos Librarian into, as well as 2 Scout squads, plus 2 units of Wolfen and a Calidus Assassin. Not too much else to say about these lists. We've been seeing Stormlances do fairly well in Space Wolves over the last couple of weeks, and this one is another example of one that is relatively standard. And with that, we can move on to some of the more widely assorted factions, starting with Thousand Sun, which was able to also go undefeated at the Bastion Games Warlords Undefeated event. Ross McCarroll took the Cult of Magic to an undefeated result at that event, running Ahriman on a Disc of Tzeentch, as well as 2 Exalted Disc Sorcerers to slow down enemies and act as good loci for their Kabbalistic rituals. 2 Infernal Masters, one of them with the Umberlific Crystal, one with the Arcane Vortex. Those guys both joined into units of 5 Rubric Marines, alongside Magnus the Red and a Thousand Suns Demon Prince. Those big characters were then joined by a ton of big monsters and vehicles, including a Mutalith Vortex Beast and 2 Thousand Suns Forge Fiends. We've been seeing lists like these pop up for Thousand Suns, although they don't although the faction in general is struggling a little bit and doesn't end up with undefeated records too often. They aren't any stranger to the top tables by any means. But lists that are trying to focus on the survivability of the faction rather than its tricksiness have been coming to the fore. This one stacking their save rerolls with powerful data sheets like a Mutalith Vortex Beast, alongside defensive benefits like the Thousand Suns Demon Prince to grant them stealth. The Vortex Beast with stealth, it's baked in 5+ invulnerable save and feel no pain, is no easy target and can survive a lot of incoming attacks. That just forces your opponent to come into the waiting guns of the Thousand Suns and allow Magnus the Red, as well as the Infernal Masters, to counterpunch and kill dramatically more than their value. The Forge Fiends are also a fairly effective unit archetype right now, and as I think we're going to talk about in the next list quite a bit, the Blast profile multi-damage attacks is kind of a prescient selection in the metagame. Armies like Adeptus Custodes and even armies like Space Marines with tons and tons of medium or heavy infantry with multiple wounds being extremely effective. And units like the Thousand Suns Forge Fiend that have multiple blasting multi-damage guns in the form of those ectoplasmic cannons are super effective against armies like that. Multiple Forge Fiends alongside the defensive effects and the movement restricting effects that Thousand Suns can employ make armies like foot slugging Adeptus Custodes absolutely have a terrible time. And if they don't have long range guns themselves to deal with those Forge Fiends, they're going to find themselves losing enormous numbers of Custodian Guard to their blast weapons. Now, speaking of blast weapons, let's move on to Tau Empire, a faction that Drew Saltzborn took to an undefeated record at the Ides of March GT. Again, I streamed this GT, so if you want some footage of this particular kind of wild variety of Tau in action, I actually streamed Drew for 3 out of the 5 games because he kept ending up on the top tables, so you can get a lot of showcase of how exactly this army works on the tabletop. This list was running 2 Cadre Fireblades, one of them equipping Exemplar of the Kauyon to get his sustained 2 effect on the table 1 turn early. We then had Long Strike as well to grant lethal hits to one of the Hammerhead gunships, as well as just generally also be a Hammerhead gunship himself. 2 Breacher teams to attach those 2 Cadre Fireblades into, and 2 Devilfish to embark those Breacher teams as well. So we're running 2 of the classic Fish of Fury, Breacher Team, Devilfish combo to move fairly quickly, pile those guys out, and fire at enemies on an objective, getting full rerolls and potentially full hit rerolls from a guiding Tetra unit as well, giving you a ton of attacks that you can try to fish for sustained 2 if you're in your Kauyon turn, which becomes easier with the attached Exemplar of the Kauyon Fireblade, then rerolling all of your wound rolls and dealing absolutely massive damage. Speaking of massive damage, we also had a ton of gunships in the list, 3 Hammerhead gunships as well as 3 Skyray gunships as well. The Hammerheads all equipped with ion cannons, a little bit interesting since those guys are normally synonymous with their big, heavy anti-tank rail cannon. However, again, the ion cannons are a very effective profile in the current metagame. When overcharged, they offer a high AP multi-damage blast profile, which is incredibly good at killing medium or heavy infantry. And with 4 of them in the list with potential access to lethal hits from Long Strike, even if they're not shooting at those infantry profiles, they can still overpower heavily armored targets with a volume of attacks. Each of those being a 3 damage conversion, which once stacked up can kill larger tanks fairly easily. On top of that, we're also covering the weaknesses of that relatively mid-strength ion cannon shot with the 3 Skyray gunships, each of those equipping Seeker Missile racks, as well as the just enormous number of tanks in the army, each equipping Seeker Missiles of their own, meaning that heavily armored targets, once exposed, can just be focused fired down with multiple Skyray gunships and multiple Seeker Missile activations from the Hammerheads or Piranhas. Speaking of which, there are also 3 Piranhas in the list. That is all supported by 3 units of Tetras to give them rerolls and marker lights for guiding, as well as a bunch of screens, including a Kroot Carnivore team, Kroot Farstalker team, 1 big unit of 8 Kroot Hounds, as well as 2 smaller units of 4 Kroot Hounds to act as utility, score objectives, and move block enemies from engaging the tanks. Overall, this army puts absolutely blistering firepower downrange, and while it is potentially possible to lock it in its deployment zone, prevent it from scoring primary objectives too often, just the Breacher teams give it the opportunity to jump out onto midboard objectives, clear out enemies, and flip the primary objective in their favor. And the army does actually just so much damage that eventually your opponent is tabled and they can no longer prevent you from scoring at the end of the game. Now we're going to keep the theme of talking about multi-damage blast weapons as we move on to Astra Militarum, which took down the Tal Visoda Winter Assault, where Eero Sokonen went undefeated with the army. This is a relatively standard variety of combined regiment from Astra Militarum, so we don't have too much to say here, although we are seeing a little bit of evolution, or I guess kind of de-evolution in the faction. The list is running Lord Solar Leontis, a platoon command squad, 2 tank commanders, and Ursula Creed alongside a Death Corps of Krieg unit. That allows you to attach both the platoon command squad and Lord Solar into the Death Corps unit, giving Lord Solar access to their Master Vox and allowing the unit to project orders out an additional distance. We then have Ursula Creed to use overlapping fields of fire on the mortar team inside the platoon command squad to potentially give you +1 AP on basically any unit that you want. Moving on, we then had 2 tank commanders with multi-meltas and demolition cannons for their orders, as well as just their high damage value with direct fire shooting as well. 2 units of Bulgarin and 3 units of Kazarkin to hold down the middle of the table and punish enemies for moving up and trying to engage your artillery, and then a bunch of artillery, 3 Manticores, as well as 2 Scout Sentinels to buff them. It's been a little while since we've seen multiple Manticores on the table. Since their points increase, they've kind of been, I think, left by the wayside in favor of Medusa carriage batteries and basilisks and other styles of indirect fire, but the Manticore profile is still incredibly strong. A high strength, kind of mid AP but high damage blast weapon is good against heavy infantry. It's even good against heavier armored vehicles, especially ones combined with the bonuses to hit, lethal hits that the detachment rule is giving them, as well as overlapping fields of fire for some additional AP on top of that. If you can shoot a target that the Scout Sentinels have also reconned, so you ignore the indirect fire penalty as well, the Manticores actually become wildly consistent and actually able to do sort of massive damage over the course of the game, all while holding down the objectives in the center with massed Kazarkin that do incredible damage for only 100 points, as well as multiple Bulgrin squads that are super hard to kill. It's a very effective combination. We've seen it do fairly well in weeks past, and I think it will continue to do so through the end of the season. It's kind of the mono list for Astra Militarum, but it is a relatively good one. Now, speaking of mono lists, we also have some Chaos Knights to talk about. This time, we don't have to talk about multi-damage blast weapons, but we do have to talk about lists that are relatively standard, although with a little bit of spice that we've been seeing brought into Chaos Knights list a little bit more often. This was Morgan Smerek, who was able to win the Energy City Open with a Traitorous Lance, led by a War Dog Stalker, running the Aura of Terror to give him locked objectives, 5 War Dog Brigands, and 5 War Dog Carnivores. Those guys were then supported by a unit of Nurglings for utility, and last, and certainly not least, actually the most expensive unit in the entire army, Rodigus, the big demon himself. Rodigus adds a very effective Deep Striker to the army. He himself is difficult to kill with a baked-in invulnerable save and a bunch of wounds and a high toughness value. He has an incredible ranged attack and strong melee, and can buff himself with his targeted +1 damage ability, giving him basically huge damage sweeps or even a fairly high damage strike attack as well once he gets into melee. That, alongside a devastating wound torrent weapon on his Eruption of Filth, and Rodigus is actually a fairly decent combatant, hard unit to kill, and occasionally can score you some secondary points by hopping in unscreened areas of your opponent's table edge. Other than that, not too much else to talk about with this list. It is a bunch of War Dogs, as we expect from Chaos Knights at this point, but Rodigus is a cool inclusion. Now, like most Chaos Knights lists, this list was not running any Lords of War, which brings us to the Lords of War GT, which was won by Adepta Sororitas, where Sean Rice took the event down with a Hallowed Martyrs detachment, led by Morven Val, Saint Thelestine, and the Triumph of Saint Catherine, alongside a Palatine with the Blade of Saint Eleanor. Now, we aren't seeing the full Dialogus combo with the Triumph of Saint Catherine, but we do have a ton of individual units in this army, so we may just simply see the army generate enough high-value miracle dice that it can still use a Palatine plus Triumph combo to relative effect. The Palatine can grant the unit that she's attached into lethal hits, which you can then, if you pile 6s through the Triumph of St. Catherine, although its ability to do this has been significantly diminished since the January data slate, only being able to affect 2 dice, I believe, instead of the limitless numbers of dice that you could potentially miracle with her aura previously. That allows you to get at least 2 lethal hits through the Palatine, converting 2 multi-melta or meltagun attacks from whatever you're shooting directly through into saving throws, since the lethal hits give you automatic wounds. She can attach either into a Battle Sisters squad, rocking meltaguns and multi-meltas, or one of the 2 Retributor squads in the army. In order to fuel that combo, we also have a ton of individual utility units, including 3 units of 2 Crusaders to grab secondaries and then die and generate miracle dice, a Sister Novitiate squad, as well as 2 units of 5 Seraphim to jump in, score secondaries, die, and then generate miracle dice. There's a little bit of a theme there. We then have 2 Immolators. Those 2 can embark either combat squads from the Battle Sisters or the Retributor squads themselves. They are equipped with multi-meltas and then can give the unit that's disembarking from them fire support to give their rerolls, on the multi-meltas that are then disembarking, making this list actually very effective at dealing with heavy armor with the mass numbers of full rerolling multi-meltas that it has. Speaking of full rerolling multi-meltas, there is also a Paragon Warsuit unit for Morven Val to join into to unlock her leadership ability of full rerolls for that unit, giving them an industrial set of full rerolling multi-meltas. We then had a Castigator and a Sororitas Rhino to pick up any of those additional units that have not been picked up by the Immolators. Probably 2 of the Arco-Flagellant units that are also in the list, to add a little bit of resilience and melee counterpunch to the center of the table. Overall, very interesting list, a lot more aggressive than we typically see from Adepta Sororitas these days. We're seeing a lot of armies running more heavily armored varieties or varieties that are mostly focused on scoring. This one is just trying to kill you with multi-meltas, and you know, that's an energy that I can really appreciate. That said, it is not quite as aggressive as the next faction we're going to talk about, because we're moving back to the Rocky Mountain Open to talk about World Eaters. Daniel Harrison took the World Eaters faction to an undefeated record at the event, running a Berserker warband led by Angron, a Winged Demon Prince, as well as a Juggernaut Lord. Those guys were backed up by 2 units of Jackals, 1 unit of 8 Bound, 2 Hellbrutes, 2 units of Chaos Bond for utility, as well as, last but certainly not least, a Khorne Lord of Skulls. The Lord of Skulls, I think, is definitely becoming a fan favorite focal point for the World Eaters faction. It does incredible damage, has strong shooting, something that the faction definitely benefits from. Already having long threat ranges and strong melee by itself, the Lord of Skulls being able to cover its bases and force its opponent to really respect it by hiding out of line of sight in the early game. The Hellbrutes as well are actually super duper strong combatants. They have the Death Company Dreadnought or Murder Fang style reactive fight, so after your opponent attacks it, it is able to be selected to fight or shoot immediately, and that can potentially break the sequence and allow it to fight multiple times in a fight phase, although that is questionable. That depends on the event that you're playing them in, because the core rules do say you can only fight once, but the Hellbrute ability implies that you can be selected to fight multiple times. Honestly not sure which one is meant to be correct, because it's never been addressed by Games Workshop, so ask your local TO. But either way, they are also able to fire their Melty-Meltas in response to incoming attacks, and are generally just a relatively strong and kind of resilient unit for only 140 points. They also back up the Lord of Skulls. Anything that can come in and kill the Lord of Skulls then gets beaten down by the Hellbrutes, or vice versa. And that moves us on to our last list of the week, this being Leagues of Votann, who were taken to an undefeated record at the Free State GT, where Dan Salmons brought his Oath Band, led by an Einherjar champion, equipping Grim Demeanor, a Grimnir with Appraising Glare, as well as an Einherjar champion. We then had 1 unit of Hearthkin Warriors, and a ton of Sagitors. The full 6 Sagitors that are legally allowed, those guys packed to the gills with 3 units of 5 Chthonian Berserks, as well as the 2 combat squads of the Hearthkin Warrior unit that can jump into 2 of them, and potentially the Grimnir in the last Sagittor as well, to allow it to actually not kill itself at the beginning of the game, thanks to the dedicated transport rules. We then had 1 unit of 3 Brokir Thunderkin, 1 big unit of 10 Einherjar Hearthguard, and a ton of 3 units of 3 Hernkin Pioneers to act as utility and screening in the early game. This is a classic variety of Leagues of Votann that we actually haven't seen too often in recent weeks. A lot of times we've been seeing a lot more combined arms styles of the faction, or armies that are based around the high defensive profiles like Einherjar Hearthguard or even Hekaton Land Fortresses. But the style list is still very effective. The Sagittor profile is very good, high resilience, and can deal significant damage once judgment tokens are applied. Plus, it gives you mass scout. You have the 3 units of Hernkin Pioneers already scouting, plus the 3 Sagittors as well. All of those can lock your opponent in their deployment zone and allow you to get incredibly strong deep strikes for your own unit of Einherjar Hearthguard as well. They're then disembarking tons of units of Hearthkin Warriors, characters, and Chthonian Berserks, all of which are relatively dangerous in their own right. This style list is incredibly dangerous going first, and still has enough speed to be dangerous going second. It's both difficult to engage with thanks to all the transport mechanics, and also good at scoring thanks to the vast majority of aggressive units that it has in its army. So it's no surprise that we see a list like this being effective. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people help me do what I do and make these videos week in and week out, as well as help me get out to events to cover them. You can also help as well by going and checking out my live stream coverage of the Ides of March GT this past weekend, and I should be live in a couple of weeks streaming another GT. So with that, I'll close things out. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.